I adjusted the hem of my black cocktail dress, smoothing out invisible wrinkles as I stood in the corner of the grand ballroom at the Westbrook Hotel. All around me, executives from Harrison and Price International mingled, their laughter echoing off marble floors and crystal chandeliers. 20 years I'd attended this annual company gala, but tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't just Olivia Barrett, executive assistant to CEO Alexander Price. Tonight, I was the woman who owned their future. They just didn't know it yet. Olivia. Alexander's voice boomed across the room. Come here, darling. Tell everyone your little story. I turned slowly, maintaining the same pleasant, unassuming smile I perfected over 2 decades of managing his calendar, his meetings, and his secrets. Alexander stood with a group of board members, his face flushed from too much expensive scotch. She's been with the company forever, he announced as I approached. Started as a temp, right, Olivia? 23 years ago, I confirmed quietly. And now look at her, he gestured expansively. Executive assistant to the CEO. It's like a fairy tale. The group chuckled indulgently. I noticed Richard Cooper, our CFO, checking his watch. He'd never approved of Alexander's tendency to parade me around at company events like some sort of success story mascot. Tell them about your investment, Alexander prodded, his voice carrying just a bit too far. The one that made you a millionaire. Ah, there it was. The real reason he called me over. 3 months ago, I'd purchased a vacation home in the Hamptons. The news had spread through the office like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know how a secretary, even an executive secretary, could afford such a purchase. Just lucky timing in the market, I said modestly. Lucky. Alexander laughed. See, she's just a secretary who got lucky. Probably read some hot tip in one of those women's magazines. More laughter. Even Richard Cooper cracked a smile. What's important, Alexander continued, clapping a hand on my shoulder, is that she knows her place. Don't you, Olivia? I met his eyes steadily. I always have, Alexander. He missed the edge in my voice, but I saw Richard Cooper's smile fade slightly. He was sharper than the others, always had been. Maybe that's why he'd been the only one to notice when I'd started buying company shares 7 years ago. Small amounts at first, nothing to raise alarms. A few hundred shares here, 1,000 there. Always through different brokers, different accounts. I'd learned about hiding paper trails from the best. I've been covering Alexander's tracks for years after all. Another drink, Olivia? Alexander offered, already turning away, dismissing me from his little court. No thank you, I replied. I should check on the catering. He waved me off, already launching into another story. I retreated to my corner, pulling out my phone. A message from my broker glowed on the screen. Final transfer complete. Congratulations, Ms. Barrett. You now own 51% of Harrison and Price International. I allowed myself a small smile. 7 years of careful planning. 7 years of reinvesting every penny, leveraging every bit of market intelligence I'd gleaned from typing Alexander's emails, sitting in on his calls, organizing his meetings. The same access he'd taken for granted had given me everything I needed to build my position. Quite a party, a quiet voice said beside me. I turned to find Margaret Wells, our head of legal, studying me with curious eyes. You seem deep in thought. Just tired, I replied. It's been a long week. She nodded slowly. I imagine it has, especially with the Peterson merger falling apart. I kept my face carefully neutral. The Peterson deal had been Alexander's pet project for months. What no one knew was that I'd been the one to quietly tip off Peterson's board about Alexander's plans to strip their assets and lay off their entire research division. These things happen, I said mildly. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd always been too perceptive for her own good. You know, Olivia, I've been reviewing some interesting trading patterns lately. Large blocks of shares being bought through various shells and holding companies. Very sophisticated stuff. I met her gaze calmly. Sounds fascinating. It is, she agreed. Almost as fascinating as how a secretary managed to buy a $3 million beach house. Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew our attention. Janet Chin, head of our Asian operations, was arriving late, and she wasn't alone. With her was Marcus Peterson himself, CEO of Peterson Technologies. Alexander's face went pale. He started pushing through the crowd toward them. But Marcus held up a hand. Don't bother, Alexander, he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. I'm not here to talk to you. I'm here to meet the person who really controls Harrison and Price now. Every head in the room turned, looking for some unknown power player. I felt Margaret stiffen beside me as realization dawned in her eyes. "It's you, isn't it?" she whispered. I handed her my empty champagne glass. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I believe I have a meeting to attend." As I walked across that ballroom floor, 2 decades of being underestimated, overlooked, and condescended to fell away with each step. The whispers started as people began to understand what was happening. By the time I reached Marcus Peterson, Alexander's face had moved past pale and straight into gray. "Miss Barrett," Marcus said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for warning us about the hostile takeover attempt. I believe we have much to discuss about a more equitable merger arrangement." "My pleasure," I replied, shaking his hand. "Shall we use the private dining room?" I had it prepared just in case. Alexander found his voice then. "What? What is this? Olivia, what are you doing?" I turned to face him, dropping the deferential mask I'd worn for so long. "Taking my place, Alexander, just like you always said I should." The room erupted in chaos. Board members pulled out phones, frantically calling lawyers and brokers. Richard Cooper slumped against the bar, looking like he might be sick. And Alexander just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. In a way, he was. Margaret appeared at my elbow, her legal mind already racing ahead. "The quarterly board meeting is next week," she said quietly. "I assume you'll want to make some changes to the voting structure." I nodded. "Among other things, I think it's time Harrison and Price had some fresh perspectives in leadership." And Alexander. I glanced at my longtime boss, still frozen in shock. "I believe he's overdue for retirement. Don't worry, I'll write him a lovely recommendation letter. After all, I've been writing all his other correspondence for years." Marcus Peterson chuckled beside me. "Shall we discuss that merger?" "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the private dining room. "After you." As we walked away, I heard Alexander's voice, small and confused. But she's just the secretary." I paused at the dining room door, looking back at him one last time. "No, Alexander, I was never just a secretary. You just never bothered to look past the title." The door closed behind us with a soft click, leaving the chaos of the ballroom behind. 23 years of playing the perfect assistant, and in one night, everything had changed. Well, not everything. I still had to order the catering for next week's board meeting, but this time, I'd be sitting at the head of the table. As I took my seat across from Marcus Peterson, I pulled out my phone and sent one final message to my broker: "Begin phase 2. The real work was just beginning. After all, I hadn't spent 7 years building my position just to maintain the status quo. Harrison and Price was about to undergo some major changes. And this time, I wouldn't be taking the minutes. I'd be calling the shots. The morning after the gala, I arrived at Harrison and Price's headquarters at exactly 7:00 a.m., just as I had for the past 23 years. The security guard did a double take when I stepped out of a chauffeur-driven Mercedes instead of my usual modest sedan. "Morning, Miss Barrett," he stammered, quickly opening the door. Ma'am, Olivia is still fine, George," I said kindly. After all, he'd been the one who'd always saved me a parking spot close to the building on late nights when I was the last to leave, long after Alexander had gone home. The lobby was already buzzing with nervous energy. News travels fast in corporate America, and the events of last night's gala had spread like wildfire. Junior executives huddled in corners, whispering behind coffee cups. Administrative assistants traded wide-eyed looks as I passed. I walked to the executive elevator, the one I'd never been allowed to use despite managing the access list for 2 decades. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. Same elegant blazer and pencil skirt I always wore, but today they were Chanel instead of department store brands. Small changes, just enough to signal that the rules had shifted. Alexander's office, my office now, was dark when I arrived. His secretary Janet's desk was empty too. On any other Monday, I'd be at my old desk outside, preparing his schedule, screening his calls, making his coffee just the way he liked it. Instead, I used my key, the one he never knew I had, to unlock his door. The room still smelled of his cologne and stale cigar smoke. I walked to his desk, running my fingers along the polished mahogany. How many times had I stood here, taking notes while he held court. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Peterson, Wall Street Journal, running the story in 30 minutes. Ready? I smiled, settling into the leather chair. Ready. At 7:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before the markets opened, the story broke. Breaking. Harrison and Price International undergoes shocking leadership change. Secret majority shareholder revealed as CEO's former secretary. My phone exploded with notifications. First came the panicked texts from board members, then emails from shareholders, then calls from every major news outlet in the country. At 8 a.m. sharp, Alexander burst into the office, face red with rage. He stopped short when he saw me in his chair. "Get out," he snarled. "This is my office." I didn't move. "Actually, Alexander, this is the CEO's office. And according to the bylaws you never bothered to read carefully, the majority shareholder has the right to appoint the CEO. Would you like to see the paperwork?" "This is impossible," he spluttered. "You're nothing but a—" "Choose your next words very carefully," I cut in, my voice silk over steel. "They might be your last ones as an employee of this company." He deflated slightly, sinking into one of the visitor chairs, the same ones I'd selected years ago when we renovated the office. "How?" he whispered. "How did you do this?" I leaned forward, folding my hands on the desk. "Do you remember the Miller acquisition in 2016? He frowned. "Of course. One of our biggest deals." "Do you remember who found the discrepancy in their financials? The one that let us negotiate the price down by 40%? "I did," he said automatically. I raised an eyebrow. "No, Alexander. I did. Just like I found the hidden value in their Asian subsidiaries that tripled our return on investment. Just like I spotted the patent infringement in their European operations that you used to pressure their board." Understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "For 23 years, I continued, I've watched you take credit for other people's work. I've covered up your mistakes, fixed your errors, and made you look brilliant. And every step of the way, I was learning. About business, about strategy, about power." "But the shares," he started. "Remember all those insider trading investigations you barely escaped? The ones where the evidence mysteriously disappeared? Well, let's just say I learned a lot about hiding paper trails." A knock at the door interrupted us. Margaret Wells entered, carrying a thick folder. "The board is assembling for an emergency meeting," she announced, "and the SEC would like to verify the share transfers." "Everything's in order," I assured her, standing up. Alexander was just leaving, for good. He stood shakily. "You can't do this. I built this company." "No," I corrected him. "You inherited this company from your father, and then you nearly ran it into the ground with your ego and short-sighted leadership. Now you can either leave quietly with a generous severance package, or I can have security escort you out while I read aloud from the file I keep on your creative accounting practices." The fight went out of him all at once. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office that had been his entire identity for so long. I looked at Margaret. "Shall we?" She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "The board is waiting, and they're terrified." "Good," I said, gathering my tablet. "They should be." The boardroom fell silent as I entered. 12 men and 1 woman, all wearing expressions ranging from shock to outrage to fear. Richard Cooper, our CFO, looked like he hadn't slept. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, taking my seat at the head of the table. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." "This is irregular." Thomas Wellington, our longest-serving board member, sputtered. "You can't just—" "I can and I have." I cut him off. "Now we can waste time arguing about it, or we can discuss the Peterson merger and our new direction for the Asian markets. Your choice." Richard Cooper cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the share transfers. They're legitimate. Ms. Barrett has been accumulating her position for years, all through legal channels." "Thank you, Richard," I said. "Now let's talk about the future. I've prepared a detailed presentation on our 5-year strategy." I pulled up the first slide, a comprehensive analysis of our market position that I'd spent years developing while sitting quietly in a corner of these same board meetings, officially just there to take notes. For the next 2 hours, I laid out my vision: expansion into emerging markets, investment in sustainable technologies, a complete overhaul of our corporate culture. By the time I finished, even Thomas Wellington had stopped protesting and started taking notes. One more thing, I said as the meeting wound down. Effective immediately, we're implementing a company-wide policy review. Pay equity, promotion practices, harassment policies, everything. Margaret will be heading up the task force. That could be expensive, Richard cautioned. So is losing talent because we're stuck in the 1950s, I countered. Speaking of which, Janet Anderson from the mailroom has a master's in supply chain management. Promote her to operations immediately and find out who else we've been overlooking. As the board filed out, Margaret stayed behind. The Wall Street Journal wants an interview, she said, and Forbes is already talking about featuring you in their next issue. I shook my head. First things first, get me the personnel files for every administrative assistant, secretary, and support staff member in the company. I want to know who else has been hiding their light under a bushel. She smiled. Already done. There's a data analyst in accounting who's been working as a clerk for 3 years. PhD from MIT, and a former management consultant working in reception because she needed flexible hours for her kids. Promote them both, I said. And Margaret? Thank you for keeping my secret all these months. She shrugged. I knew something was coming when I traced those share purchases. I just didn't know what. Besides, it's about time someone shook up the boys' club. By the end of the week, Harrison and Price was transformed. Alexander's old guard was gone, replaced by a diverse team of leaders chosen for talent rather than connections. The Peterson merger was proceeding smoothly, with both companies' stock prices soaring. And me? I kept my old assistant's desk outside the CEO's office. Not to work at it, but as a reminder. Every morning when I walked past it, I thought about all the other just secretaries out there, watching and waiting for their moment. The following Monday, I called my first all-company meeting. Standing at the podium, looking out at thousands of faces, I thought about that night at the gala when Alexander had told me to know my place. For too long, I began, this company has wasted its most valuable resource, its people. We've overlooked talent because it didn't come in the package we expected. We've dismissed wisdom because it came from the wrong desk. That ends today. I paused, making eye contact with Janet from the mailroom, now wearing a crisp suit in her role as operations director. From now on, there is no just anything at Harrison and Price. No just secretaries. No just clerks. No just assistants. There are only people, talented, ambitious, worthy people. And if anyone tells you to know your place, remember this. Your place is wherever your talent and hard work can take you. The applause was deafening. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I found a gift on my desk. It was my old nameplate from when I was Alexander's secretary, but someone had modified it. Under my name, in elegant script, were the words, "Never just anything." I placed it on my desk, right next to my CEO nameplate. A reminder that power doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a quiet woman sitting in the corner, taking notes, watching, waiting, and building an empire in silence. The next morning, the Wall Street Journal ran another story. Harrison and Price stock hits all-time high under new leadership. Below the headline was a photo of me at my old assistant's desk, now displayed prominently in my office. The caption read, Olivia Barrett, CEO, from taking notes to taking control. I smiled, remembering Alexander's words from the gala. Yes, I had gotten lucky, but luck had nothing to do with what came next. That was all strategy, patience, and the power of being underestimated. After all, I wasn't just a secretary who got lucky. I was a CEO who got smart. And this was only the beginning. The mahogany conference table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights as Marcus Sterling, CEO of Meridian Financial Group, stood at its head, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his face twisted in what he probably thought was righteous indignation. 40 pairs of eyes darted between him and me, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Miss Sullivan, he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who enjoyed public displays of power. Your recent actions have forced my hand. The board agrees that your methods are too risky for a company of our standing. I sat there, perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the leather portfolio in front of me. Inside that portfolio were documents that would make his world collapse in exactly 3 days. But for now, I simply listened. You're terminated, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. After all, I was Emma Sullivan, the woman who had saved Meridian Financial Group from 3 potential disasters in the past year alone. The risk management director who had turned their struggling portfolio into a fortress. The person who had just prevented a $50 million loss last week. But Marcus Sterling didn't care about any of that. He only cared about control, about showing everyone that he was in charge. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had seen this coming months ago, and I had prepared accordingly. I stood slowly, gathering my things with deliberate calm. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said quietly, my voice steady. Then I walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and whispered conversations. It was exactly 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and phase 1 of my plan was complete. 6 months earlier, the first time I realized Marcus Sterling would try to destroy me was during a routine budget meeting. I had just presented a new risk management strategy that would save the company millions in unnecessary hedging costs. The data was solid, the math impeccable, but Marcus's eyes had narrowed in that peculiar way that meant he felt threatened. "That's quite ambitious, Emma," he said, emphasizing my first name like it was a weapon. "Perhaps a bit too ambitious for someone at your level." I had been at Meridian for 7 years by then, brought in during the financial crisis when they desperately needed someone who understood both risk and innovation. I had delivered, consistently and brilliantly, turning their risk management division from a corporate afterthought into the company's backbone. But Marcus had only been CEO for 8 months, brought in by a board that wanted a dynamic leader for their public image. He had the right pedigree, the right connections, the right look. What he didn't have was any real understanding of how financial risk actually worked. That day, watching him dismiss my strategy without even understanding it, I made a decision. I would protect myself quietly and thoroughly because men like Marcus Sterling didn't fire people. They destroyed them. I began by documenting everything. Every email, every meeting, every decision. I created encrypted backups of all my risk analyses, storing them securely off-site. But more importantly, I started laying the groundwork for something bigger. You see, Meridian's entire operation depended on their credit lines. Without them, the company's daily operations would grind to a halt. The biggest of these, a $50 million revolving credit facility, was coming up for renewal. Marcus, focused on his public appearances and corporate politics, had delegated the renewal process entirely to my department. What he didn't bother to read in the paperwork was that the renewal wasn't just a simple extension. It required a complete restructuring with new terms, new guarantees, and most importantly, new ownership of the special purpose vehicle that actually held the credit facility. I spent 3 months quietly negotiating with Somerset Bank, building relationships, explaining my methodology. They understood what Marcus never could, that true financial security came from understanding risk, not avoiding it. When they offered to let me take personal ownership of the SPV that would hold the credit line, I accepted with a small smile. The paperwork was complex, deliberately so. Buried in hundreds of pages of legal language was the simple fact that I, through a series of perfectly legal corporate structures, would effectively control Meridian's financial lifeline. Marcus signed off on it without reading past the first page, too busy preparing for another TV interview about his innovative leadership. Meanwhile, I continued to excel at my job, much to Marcus's growing discomfort. I prevented a massive loss during a market downturn in March. I restructured our Asian exposure to avoid currency risks. I built systems that caught trading errors before they could become disasters. Each success made Marcus more uneasy. He started excluding me from key meetings, removed me from copied emails, had his assistant accidentally leave me off calendar invites. Classic signs of a CEO preparing to remove someone he saw as a threat. The final straw came last week. Our trading desk had taken a massive position in emerging market derivatives, authorized directly by Marcus without consulting risk management. When the markets turned against us, we were looking at a potential $50 million loss. I spent 48 hours straight at my desk, analyzing patterns, running scenarios, building hedges. In the end, I not only prevented the loss but managed to turn it into a small profit. The traders called it brilliant. The risk management team called it inspired. Marcus called it unnecessarily complicated and dangerously aggressive. That's when I knew my time was running out. I could see it in the way he stalked the halls, in the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, in the sudden requests for detailed reports on all my methodologies. So I prepared. I updated all my documentation. I confirmed my control of the credit facility. I made sure every single action I had taken was not only legal but provably necessary for the company's survival. Then I waited. The email came last night. Mandatory all-hands meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. No agenda. No explanation. Classic ambush tactic. I arrived early, dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit that had cost me a month's salary. Image matters in finance, especially when you're about to let someone underestimate you for the last time. The room filled quickly. Department heads, senior managers, even some junior staff. Marcus wanted an audience for this. He wanted to make an example of me. I watched him stride in at exactly 9 a.m., flanked by 2 security guards and someone from HR. He didn't even try to make it look professional. No private conversation, no dignified exit. He wanted a show. And now here I was, walking out of Meridian Financial Group for what they thought was the last time. Security escort behind me, cardboard box in my arms for theatrical effect. Anything important had been removed days ago. Employees peeking out from behind their monitors to watch my walk of shame. I kept my head high, my pace steady. The security guard, Jim, who had always been kind to me, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan," he whispered as we reached the lobby. "This isn't right." I gave him a small smile. "Don't worry, Jim. Everything happens for a reason." Outside, the city bustled under a clear autumn sky. I took a deep breath of crisp October air and checked my watch. 9:47 a.m. In exactly 3 days, Marcus Sterling would learn what real risk looked like. But for now, I had a breakfast meeting to attend with the CFO of Somerset Bank, who was very interested in hearing about my sudden availability. I slipped into the back of my waiting car, not a taxi, but a private town car I had arranged the night before. Image matters in finance, after all, especially when you're about to turn from fired employee to the person who holds your former company's financial fate in your hands. The driver pulled away from the curb smoothly as I pulled out my phone. A text from my lawyer confirmed that everything was in place. Another from my private banker assured me that my own finances were secure and untouchable. I leaned back against the leather seat, allowing myself a moment to appreciate the perfect execution of Phase 1. Marcus thought he had won. He thought he had proven his power, established his dominance, eliminated a threat. What he had actually done was activate a sequence of events that would teach him the true meaning of risk management. Because while he had been focused on his public image, I had been focused on something far more important, understanding exactly how power really worked in the world of high finance. And in 3 days, when Somerset Bank's statement revealed exactly who controlled Meridian's critical credit line, Marcus Sterling would learn that sometimes the biggest risk is underestimating the person you're trying to destroy. But that was Phase 2. For now, I had a breakfast meeting to attend and a story to begin telling. After all, timing is everything in finance. And my timing was perfect. The Somerset Bank executive dining room had that particular kind of hushed elegance that only old money could create. Crystal glasses caught the morning light, white tablecloths draped with mathematical precision, and the subtle scent of fresh coffee mixed with power and privilege. William Hayes, CFO of Somerset Bank, stood as I approached the corner table. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "Emma," he said warmly, "I heard about this morning's theatrics at Meridian." I settled into the leather chair across from him, accepting a cup of perfectly brewed coffee from a discreet waiter. News travels fast in financial circles, especially when someone makes a mistake as colossal as Marcus Sterling just did. William's eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and anticipation. "I assume everything is proceeding according to plan?" I took a small sip of coffee, savoring the moment. Phase 1 is complete. Marcus did exactly what we expected. Made it public, made it dramatic, made it impossible to quietly reverse course. William nodded, pulling out a sleek leather portfolio. Our timing couldn't be better. The quarterly review of all major credit facilities is scheduled for Friday morning. Marcus will be required to attend personally as CEO. And the documentation. All in order. The ownership structure of the SPV controlling their credit line will be revealed as part of standard compliance protocols. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. I must admit, I'm looking forward to seeing his face when he realizes what he's done. I reached into my bag and retrieved a USB drive. This contains detailed reports of every risk management decision I've made in the past year, including the full analysis of last week's derivatives save. Your risk committee might find it interesting reading. William pocketed the drive smoothly. I'm sure they will. Now, shall we discuss your future role at Somerset? The rest of breakfast passed in a comfortable discussion of possibilities. By the time I left, I had a verbal offer to become Somerset's new head of strategic risk management at triple my Meridian salary. But that would come later. For now, there was work to be done. Back in my car, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Meridian's HR department, 5 from their legal team, and one very interesting text from Sarah Chen, my former deputy. Complete chaos here. MS trying to access your risk management systems. Nobody can understand your notation system. Of course they couldn't. I had developed my own proprietary method of coding risk assessments over the years. It was perfectly logical if you understood the underlying mathematics, which Marcus very clearly didn't. I smiled, remembering his dismissal of my methods as unnecessarily complicated. He was about to discover just how necessary that complication had been. By afternoon, the first real tremors began. My phone buzzed with a message from my inside source at Meridian's trading desk. Emergency meeting called. MS trying to explain your hedging strategies to the board. Making 0 sense. Trading suspended on 3 major positions. I could picture it perfectly, Marcus standing in the same conference room where he'd fired me this morning, trying to explain complex risk management protocols he'd never bothered to understand. Probably using terms incorrectly, missing the subtle interplays between positions, not seeing the carefully constructed safety nets I'd built into every strategy. At 4:45 p.m., just before market close, another text from Sarah. MS just tried to unwind your E&G hedge structure. Nearly caused a $10 million loss before risk committee shut it down. Board member Jenkins asking questions. That would be Catherine Jenkins, the only board member with actual banking experience. She'd always understood my work, even if she'd been outvoted by Marcus's supporters. Now she would be starting to see the full picture. I spent that evening in my home office, a glass of expensive bourbon at my elbow, watching the pieces fall into place. My lawyer called to confirm that all my work at Meridian was properly documented and legally protected. My private banker reported unusual activity. Meridian's Treasury Department making inquiries about certain structured finance vehicles. They were starting to dig, but they were already too late. Day 2 began with a series of increasingly urgent emails from Meridian's legal department, all marked strictly confidential, urgent response required. They wanted to discuss terms of my departure, wanted to ensure a smooth transition, wanted to maintain positive professional relationships. I archived each one without responding. Timing was crucial now, and silence was my most powerful weapon. Mid-morning brought more news from Sarah. MS called emergency risk committee meeting, tried to blame you for hiding critical information. Catherine Jenkins shut him down hard, demanded to see full credit facility documentation. I could almost hear Marcus's expensive shoes pacing across his office floor. He would be starting to feel it now, the first real tendrils of fear. His attempt to blame me would have backfired, making him look either incompetent for not understanding his own company's risk structures or negligent for not properly overseeing them. By lunch, the situation had escalated. William called from Somerset. Your replacement at Meridian just tried to access the credit facility documentation. Our compliance department, following standard protocols, informed them that any changes or access requests would need approval from the facility's controlling entity. And how did they react to that? I asked, already knowing the answer. Complete confusion. Apparently, Marcus Sterling himself got on the phone, demanding to know why he needed approval from anyone for his own company's credit line. I smiled, picturing Marcus's face turning that particular shade of red it got when things didn't bend to his will. I assume your team maintained proper protocol. Of course, they simply referred him to the standard documentation. Documentation that he signed, might I add, without reading. The afternoon brought more chaos. Meridian's stock price started to wobble as rumors of risk management issues circulated through the market. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just enough uncertainty to make traders nervous. Sarah's updates became more frequent. 2:15 p.m. MSN closed-door meeting with board. Lots of shouting. 3:30 p.m. Legal team requesting all risk management documentation from last 6 months. 4:45 p.m. Trading desk frozen. Nobody willing to take positions without your sign-off protocols. I spent the evening reviewing my documentation one final time, making sure every detail was perfect. Tomorrow would bring the quarterly review at Somerset, and with it, the moment Marcus Sterling discovered exactly what his hasty power play had cost him. My phone buzzed one final time before midnight. A message from Katherine Jenkins herself. Starting to understand what really happened here. Would like to meet privately tomorrow after the Somerset review. This isn't over. No, I thought, setting my phone aside and pouring another bourbon. It certainly isn't. Day 3 dawned clear and cold. I dressed carefully in a black Armani suit that cost more than most junior analysts made in a month. Image matters in finance, especially on days when you're about to turn the tables. I arrived at Somerset Bank 30 minutes early, using my new executive access card to enter through the private entrance. William met me in his office, looking impeccable and slightly amused. Marcus Sterling and his team just arrived, he reported. They're in the main conference room, trying to look confident. The risk committee is reviewing your USB data now. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. The timing of your firing couldn't have been better. Makes the whole reveal much more dramatic. I checked my reflection in his office window, adjusting my jacket slightly. Everything ready. All set. Standard quarterly review presentation, followed by the compliance update, ending with the ownership structure review. Should take about an hour to get to the big moment. I nodded, checking my watch. In exactly 60 minutes, Marcus Sterling would learn the true meaning of risk management, and I would be there to watch it happen. Shall we? William gestured to the door. I picked up my leather portfolio, the same one I'd had at my firing, and smiled. Time for phase 2. The conference room was packed when we entered through the private door behind the presentation screen. Through the one-way glass, I could see Marcus at the head of the Meridian team, trying to project confidence but fidgeting with his gold cufflinks, a tell he never knew he had. William took his seat at the head of the Somerset side. I stayed in the shadows behind the screen, waiting. Right on schedule, the presentation began. Standard quarterly review materials, market positions, risk exposures, all the normal banking discussions that Marcus usually ignored. Then came the compliance update. I watched Marcus start to shift uncomfortably as the discussion turned to credit facility documentation. Watched him loosen his tie slightly as they discussed control structures. Watched his face start to pale as the words beneficial ownership appeared on the screen. And then, at exactly 10:17 a.m., it happened. The Somerset risk officer pulled up the ownership diagram of Meridian's credit facility. There, in clear corporate structure boxes, was the chain of control, leading directly to a holding company owned by one Emma Sullivan. The room went completely silent. Marcus's face, already pale, turned absolutely white. He started to stand, then fell back into his chair as the full implications hit him. He hadn't just fired an employee. He had fired the person who controlled his company's financial lifeline. Phase 2 was complete, and Phase 3 was about to begin. Part 3, The Reckoning. The next few moments in Somerset Bank's conference room felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Marcus Sterling, the man who had so confidently fired me 3 days ago, sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of dawning horror as he stared at the ownership structure displayed on the screen. This can't be right, he stammered, his voice having lost all its previous authority. There must be some mistake. William Hayes, ever the consummate banker, smiled politely. I assure you, Mr. Sterling, there's no mistake. The documentation is quite clear. Your signature is on every page. That's when I stepped out from behind the screen, enjoying the way Marcus's eyes widened in shock. Perhaps, I said quietly, you should have read those papers more carefully before signing them. The room erupted in barely contained chaos. Meridian's legal counsel started frantically flipping through documents. Their CFO had turned an interesting shade of gray. And Katherine Jenkins, watching from the end of the table, had the smallest smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Marcus shot to his feet, his face now turning from white to red. This is manipulation. Fraud. I'll have you arrested for this. I placed my portfolio on the table, opening it with deliberate calm. Everything was done completely legally, Marcus. The ownership structure was clearly detailed in the documentation. Documentation that you signed multiple times. I slid out a stack of papers, his signature prominent on each one. Would you like to review them now? He fell back into his chair, the fight visibly draining from him as reality set in. The entire room watched in silence as the implications became clear to everyone. The man who had publicly fired me 3 days ago had just discovered that I controlled his company's financial lifeline. William cleared his throat. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the terms of the credit facility's continuation. Marcus's head snapped up. Terms? What terms? Well, I said, taking a seat at the table. As the controlling entity of the credit facility, I have certain concerns about Meridian's current risk management practices, particularly in light of recent leadership decisions. Catherine Jenkins leaned forward. I believe the board would be very interested in hearing these concerns. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in professional decimation. I methodically laid out every flaw in Marcus's leadership. The ignored warnings, the reckless trading decisions, the dismantling of key risk protocols. Each point was documented, dated, and devastating. By the time I finished, Marcus looked like a man who had aged a decade in a day. But I wasn't done yet. So, I continued, here are my terms for maintaining the credit facility. I slid a document across the table. First, a complete overhaul of Meridian's risk management structure. Second, an independent audit of all trading positions taken under Mr. Sterling's direction. And third, pause for effect, the immediate appointment of a new chief executive officer. Marcus exploded out of his chair. You can't do this. You can't just walk in here and demand. Actually, Catherine interrupted, she can. Without this credit facility, Meridian would be in breach of its regulatory capital requirements by tomorrow morning. The board cannot ignore that reality. She turned to me, professional respect evident in her eyes. Though I assume you have a candidate in mind for the CEO position? I smiled. Somerset Bank has already approved William Hayes for the role, should the board agree. His risk management experience would be invaluable. William nodded graciously as Marcus sputtered in disbelief. The man was watching his empire crumble, and there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Emergency board calls were made, lawyers consulted, documents prepared. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. Marcus Sterling had been removed as CEO, with a carefully worded press release citing strategic differences. William Hayes was appointed as interim CEO with full board approval. I was named Chief Risk Officer of both Meridian and Somerset, with oversight of a newly created risk management structure. And most satisfyingly, every person Marcus had fired or pushed out over the past 8 months was being contacted about returning to their positions. As the sun set over the city skyline, I stood in what had been Marcus's office, now temporarily mine until William took over next week. Catherine Jenkins knocked on the doorframe. That, she said, entering with 2 glasses of expensive scotch, was the most elegant corporate takedown I've ever witnessed. I accepted the glass with a small smile. Sometimes the best risk management strategy is to let others underestimate you. She laughed, settling into one of the leather chairs. You know, when Marcus first announced your firing, I almost intervened. Almost, but something in your expression that day told me to wait. I appreciate that, I said, taking a sip of scotch. It made the reveal much more effective. That it did. She raised her glass in a toast to the woman who turned being fired into a corporate coup. Later that evening, as I packed up the last of Marcus's belongings from what would soon be William's office, Sarah appeared in the doorway. The trading floor is celebrating, she reported, grinning. Someone ordered champagne, and Marcus's old executive team is trying desperately to update their resumes before the mass exodus begins. I nodded, placing Marcus's pretentious motivational posters in a box. Change is healthy in corporate culture. Speaking of which, how do you feel about a promotion? I'll need a deputy chief risk officer I can trust. Her eyes widened. Seriously. But what about Somerset? I'll be overseeing risk for both institutions, part of the new partnership structure William and I designed. I smiled. It turns out getting fired was the best career move I never planned. That night, I stood at my penthouse window, watching the city lights twinkle below. My phone had been buzzing all day with congratulations, job offers, and interview requests. The Financial Times wanted to do a profile. Harvard Business Review was interested in a case study. And Marcus? He had been last seen clearing out his desk, his perfect suit wrinkled, his golden boy image tarnished beyond repair. I sipped my bourbon, savoring the warmth. In the end, it hadn't been about revenge. It had been about something far more important, proving that true power doesn't come from titles or corner offices. It comes from understanding the game better than anyone else, from seeing the moves others miss, from being willing to be underestimated until the perfect moment to strike. A text message lit up my phone. It was from William. Board dinner tomorrow to celebrate the new partnership. Marcus's face when he realized who owned the credit line? Priceless. See you at 8. I smiled, remembering that moment of revelation. Marcus had thought he was showing strength by firing me in front of everyone. Instead, he had staged the perfect backdrop for his own downfall. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The security guard, the same one who had escorted me out 3 days ago, grinned and waved me through. "Welcome back, Ms. Sullivan." I strode through the lobby, heels clicking on marble, employees nodding respectfully as I passed. The fear was gone from their eyes, replaced by something better, admiration. Not for my title or my power, but for how I had wielded it. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. Same suit, same portfolio, same calm expression. But something was different now. I wasn't just a risk manager anymore. I was living proof that sometimes the biggest risk is underestimating the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who understand that true power isn't about making noise, it's about making moves. The doors opened onto the executive floor, and I stepped out into my new reality. There was work to be done, systems to rebuild, trust to restore. But first, I had a story to tell the eager young analysts gathering in the conference room. A story about risk, about patience, and about the day a CEO learned that sometimes the person you're firing is the person you really can't afford to lose. Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't in proving others wrong. It's in proving yourself right. And I had done exactly that, one signature, one strategy, one careful move at a time. The conference room was packed when I entered. Young faces looked up eagerly, laptops open, ready to learn. I placed my portfolio on the podium and smiled. "Good morning," I began. "Today's lesson is about understanding risk. Real risk, the kind that doesn't show up on spreadsheets or risk assessments. The kind that comes from forgetting that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards." And as I launched into my presentation, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I looked exactly like what I was. A woman who had turned getting fired into the ultimate power move. Perhaps I should send Marcus a thank you note. After all, he had given me the perfect stage for my greatest risk management triumph yet. But that could wait. Right now, I had an empire to run. The sleek conference room at Summit Ventures felt like a tomb. 6 investors in expensive suits sat around the polished table, their faces a mixture of boredom and barely concealed disdain. I had just finished my presentation about Neuratech, my AI-powered predictive analytics platform that could revolutionize supply chain management. "Let me get this straight," Michael Thorne, Summit's managing partner, said with a smirk. "You think you've built an AI that can predict supply chain disruptions better than Amazon's own systems? Better than what Target and Walmart have spent billions developing?" I stood my ground, tablet in hand, the platform's interface still glowing on the screen behind me. The test results speak for themselves. Neuratech has achieved 97% accuracy in predicting supply chain disruptions up to 6 months in advance. "That's worthless," Thorne interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "Your product is worthless, Ms. Morgan. You're a software engineer with no business experience, no major clients, and no understanding of how enterprise software actually works." The other investors nodded in agreement, already closing their portfolios, already dismissing me. They had made up their minds before I'd even walked in. "Thank you for your time," I said quietly, gathering my materials. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I had learned long ago that showing weakness in rooms like this was fatal. As I walked out, I heard one of them chuckle. "Can you believe she thought she could compete with Amazon?" I smiled slightly, thinking about the email sitting in my inbox, the one they hadn't let me mention. The one from Amazon's head of strategic acquisitions, requesting a private demo of Neurotech next week. But that would come later. First, I had a story to tell. A story that started 3 years ago, in a very different room, with a very different kind of rejection. 3 years earlier. "I'm sorry, Olivia, but we're going to have to let you go." I sat in my supervisor's office at Global Logistics Solutions, staring at the man who had just ended my 8-year career as a supply chain software developer. Dave Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to look sympathetic, but mostly looking relieved. "The automated prediction system you proposed, it's just too experimental. Too risky. We need to stick with proven solutions." I nodded slowly, thinking about the hundreds of hours I'd spent analyzing supply chain failures, the patterns I'd discovered, the solution I'd built in my free time. I had shown them how their current system missed crucial warning signs, how it failed to connect seemingly unrelated data points that could predict disruptions months in advance. They hadn't just rejected my idea. They had fired me for developing it independently, claiming it violated my employment agreement. They wanted safe, predictable, mediocre. I gave them what they wanted: a quiet exit, a signed NDA, a promise not to compete directly with their outdated systems. What they didn't know was that I had already laid the groundwork for something much bigger. The termination package they offered, 6 months' salary as severance, wasn't just the end of my career at GLS. It was seed funding for my revolution. I spent the first month building out the core of Neurotech in my home office. 18-hour days fueled by coffee and determination. My savings dwindled. My friends worried. My family suggested more realistic career options. But I had seen something none of them could see. In the massive datasets I had analyzed at GLS and the countless supply chain disruptions I had studied, there were patterns. Subtle connections that human analysts missed. Early warning signs that existing software couldn't detect. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, 4 months after my firing. I had been working on a new type of neural network, one that could process supply chain data differently. Instead of looking for direct cause and effect relationships, it identified complex patterns across seemingly unrelated factors. Weather patterns in Southeast Asia, social media sentiment about manufacturing companies, currency fluctuations in emerging markets, minor shipping delays that, when viewed in isolation, seemed insignificant. But when you connected them properly, when you let the eye see the bigger picture, they became crystal clear warning signs of major disruptions. I called it the Nexus Protocol, an AI system that could see the invisible threads connecting global supply chains, predicting problems before they emerged. The first test run was on historical data from a major electronics manufacturer's 2019 supply chain crisis. Neurotech spotted the warning signs 6 months before the disruption hit. Signs that every other system, every human analyst, had missed. I ran more tests: pharmaceutical supply chains, automotive parts, retail inventory. Each time, Neurotech found the patterns. Each time, it predicted the disruptions with uncanny accuracy. By month 5, I had a working prototype. By month 6, I had preliminary patents filed. What I didn't have was money. The severance was running out, and AI infrastructure isn't cheap. That's when I met Sophia Martinez. She found me through a tech forum where I had posted some theoretical questions about neural network architecture. She was a former supply chain executive turned angel investor, and she understood immediately what I was building. "This isn't just software," she said during our first coffee meeting. "This is a fundamental shift in how we understand supply chain dynamics." She invested $250,000 for a 5% stake. More importantly, she introduced me to her network. Small companies willing to beta test the system. Data scientists who helped refine the algorithms. Lawyers to strengthen the patents. For the next 2 years, we built in silence. No flashy announcements, no TechCrunch articles. Just quiet, relentless improvement. Neurotech evolved from a prediction tool into a comprehensive supply chain intelligence platform. It didn't just spot potential disruptions. It suggested alternative suppliers, calculated risk factors, and provided detailed mitigation strategies. The early clients were small, but the results were undeniable. A medical supply company avoided a critical shortage by switching suppliers 2 months before their primary vendor faced a production crisis. A food distributor rerouted their entire logistics network a week before unprecedented storms shut down major shipping lanes. Word started to spread in certain circles. The right circles. Companies began reaching out quietly, asking for demos, wanting to test the system against their own data. That's when the first acquisition offer came. A major consulting firm offered $50 million for the technology. I declined. They came back with $100 million. I declined again. Because by then, I had seen the full potential of what we had built. Neuratech wasn't just another enterprise software tool. It was a window into the hidden patterns that governed global commerce. And someone else had noticed. Someone big. The email arrived on a Thursday evening, just 2 days before my ill-fated meeting at Summit Ventures. Dear Ms. Morgan, I lead strategic acquisitions at Amazon. We've been following Neuratech's development with great interest. Our preliminary analysis suggests your predictive accuracy exceeds anything currently available in the market. We would like to arrange a private demonstration next week. Regards, James Wilson, VP of Strategic Acquisitions, Amazon. I hadn't mentioned the email during my pitch at Summit Ventures. I hadn't mentioned the other interested parties, the preliminary acquisition talks, the major retailers quietly testing the system. Let them think Neuratech was worthless. Let them dismiss the woman who had spent 3 years building something they couldn't understand. Because in exactly 1 week, when Amazon's offer became public, when their phones started ringing with calls from reporters asking about the startup they had laughed out of their office, they would learn a valuable lesson. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones you're too blind to see. I stepped into my car outside Summit Ventures, checking my calendar. The Amazon demo was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Let them laugh. In a week, the laughter would stop, and a very different sound would fill those expensive conference rooms. The sound of opportunity slipping through their fingers. Amazon's Seattle headquarters loomed against the gray morning sky, a testament to what happens when someone builds something others call impossible. I straightened my blazer, checked my reflection in the lobby's polished marble, and took a deep breath. Ms. Morgan, a tall woman in a crisp suit approached, tablet in hand. I'm Jennifer Hayes, James Wilson's chief of staff. They're ready for you in the executive conference room. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor was silent. I used those 30 seconds to center myself, remembering every dismissive investor, every doubting executive, every person who said it couldn't be done. Their skepticism had only made Neuratech stronger. The conference room doors opened to reveal a scene very different from Summit Ventures. Instead of bored investors checking their phones, 12 intense-looking people sat forward in their chairs, laptops open, clearly having done their homework. James Wilson, Amazon's VP of Strategic Acquisitions, rose to greet me. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with the focused energy of someone who evaluated revolutionary technology for a living. Ms. Morgan, he said, shaking my hand firmly. Thank you for coming. We've been analyzing Neuratech's test results for the past month. Frankly, they seem too good to be true. I smiled, setting up my laptop. That's why I brought a challenge for you. Give me your 3 most difficult supply chain disruptions from the past year. Ones you didn't see coming. Let's run them through Neuratech Live. A murmur of interest ran through the room. James glanced at his team, then nodded. Amanda, get the Singapore semiconductor crisis data. Peter, the Brazilian transport strike, and let's see the European energy shortage numbers. For the next 2 hours, I ran Neuratech through its paces. The system didn't just identify the warning signs they had missed. It showed exactly how those signs connected, how they amplified each other, how they created the perfect conditions for disruption. When I showed how Neuratech could have predicted the semiconductor crisis 8 months in advance, a heavy silence fell over the room. These people had lived through that crisis, had dealt with the fallout, had explained to their bosses why they hadn't seen it coming. This is, James paused, choosing his words carefully, significantly more advanced than anything we've evaluated. How did you achieve this level of predictive accuracy? I pulled up the Nexus protocol architecture, because everyone else is looking at supply chains as linear systems. Action and reaction. Cause and effect. But they're not linear. They're neural. Every point connects to every other point in ways that traditional analytics can't see. The technical team leaned forward, eyes widening as they understood the implications. This wasn't just better software. This was a fundamental reimagining of how supply chain intelligence worked. We'd like to move forward with acquisition discussions, James said finally. Our technical team will need to do a deep dive, of course, but preliminary valuation looks very promising. I nodded calmly, even as my heart raced. I should mention that we're in talks with other interested parties. Oh, we know, he smiled. Walmart's chief innovation officer has been asking about you. Target's supply chain team ran some tests, and Google's acquisition department has been sniffing around. He leaned forward. But we think Amazon is the best home for this technology. We can scale it globally within months. As I packed up my equipment, James walked me to the elevator. We'll have an initial offer for you by Friday. In the meantime, I suggest keeping this meeting confidential. Once word gets out, he didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen when the market learned that Amazon was seriously pursuing Neuratech. The next 48 hours were a blur of due diligence meetings, technical reviews, and increasingly urgent calls from other interested parties. Sophia called Wednesday morning, her voice excited. Olivia, something's happening. I just got 3 calls from major VCs asking about Neuratech. What did you do? Amazon's moving fast, I replied, watching my email as another meeting request came in, this one from Google's acquisition team. Words starting to leak. Summit Ventures called, she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Suddenly they're very interested in setting up another meeting. I thought about Michael Thorne's smirking face, his dismissive wave. Let them wait. By Thursday afternoon, the technology blogs were buzzing with rumors. TechCrunch published a speculative piece about Amazon's interest in a revolutionary AI supply chain startup. Reuters ran a story about unusual activity in the supply chain software sector. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors who had ignored my emails for months now wanted urgent meetings. Former skeptics suddenly saw the genius in Neuratech's approach. Even my old boss from GLS tried to reach out, probably remembering too late who owned the patents. But I was focused on one email, the one that arrived at 4:47 p.m. on Thursday. Dear Ms. Morgan, following our technical review and market analysis, we would like to present Amazon's formal offer for Neuratech acquisition. The initial terms are outlined in the attached document, but the headline number is $500 million, with potential earnouts bringing the total to $650 million. We're prepared to announce next week, pending your agreement. Best regards, James Wilson. I sat in my home office, staring at the number on my screen. $500 million, more with earnouts. For the technology they said would never work. For the company they called worthless. My phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Summit Ventures is getting desperate. Thorne just offered to come to your house for a meeting. Should I tell him you're busy counting your soon-to-be millions? I smiled, remembering his words. Your product is worthless. How quickly things change when you're proven right. The next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office to review Amazon's offer. The terms were aggressive but fair. They wanted to move fast before Google or Walmart could counter. As we went through the documents, my lawyer's phone kept lighting up with notifications. The story was spreading. Major news outlets were connecting the dots. The business world was about to learn that the biggest tech giant in history was betting big on the startup that everyone else had dismissed. We should expect significant media attention once this goes public, she said, sliding another document across the desk, especially given the size of the offer. I nodded, signing where indicated. Let them talk. The numbers speak for themselves. Later that day, as I drove home, I passed the Global Logistics Solutions building where I'd been fired 3 years ago. Their stock had dropped 23% since the first rumors about Neuratech began circulating. Funny how karma works. My phone rang through the car's speakers. James Wilson. Olivia, he said, sounding excited. The board just approved the final terms. We're announcing Monday morning before market open. Are you ready for what's coming? I smiled, thinking about all the people who were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating the wrong person. I've been ready for 3 years, James. Let's show them what worthless looks like. The weekend passed in a blur of final preparations, legal documents, press statements, technical transition plans. But through it all, I kept thinking about next week, when all those investors who had laughed would open their phones to see the headlines. Because sometimes success isn't just about proving your worth. Sometimes it's about watching others realize exactly how wrong they were. And on Monday morning, when Amazon's press release hit the wires, when the business world exploded with news of the $500 million acquisition, when Summit Ventures phones started ringing off the hook with angry calls from their investors wondering how they had missed this opportunity, I would be sitting quietly in my office, reading every headline, savoring every word. Let them call it luck. Let them say they almost invested. Let them scramble to explain why they dismissed a $500 million company as worthless. I had stopped caring about their opinions 3 years ago. Now I only cared about their regret. Sunday night, as the final hours ticked down to the announcement, I received one last email. From Michael Thorne. Ms. Morgan, I feel I may have been hasty in my assessment of Neuratech. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss potential investment opportunities. Best regards, Michael Thorne, Managing Partner, Summit Ventures. I clicked delete without responding. Tomorrow, he would get his answer in the form of headlines he would never forget. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. And sometimes the best response to worthless is to show them exactly what they missed. The stage was set. The papers were signed. And in just a few hours, the world would learn what real value looks like. Monday morning dawned clear and bright. I sat in my home office at 5:30 a.m., watching financial news channels on mute, waiting for the announcement that would change everything. My phone was already buzzing with texts from Sofia. CNBC has a breaking news graphic ready. Bloomberg's running teasers about a major tech acquisition. Wall Street Journal just went live with it. I unmuted the TV just in time to hear the CNBC anchor's voice catch with excitement. Breaking news in the tech sector. Amazon has announced the acquisition of artificial intelligence startup Neuratech for $500 million, with additional earnouts potentially bringing the total to $650 million. The company's AI-powered supply chain prediction technology has been called revolutionary by industry experts. My email inbox exploded. My phone started ringing nonstop. But I was focused on one particular notification. A LinkedIn message from Michael Thorne at Summit Ventures, timestamped 1 minute after the announcement. Olivia, please call me immediately. We need to discuss this situation. I smiled, remembering his words from just last week. Your product is worthless. Now he wanted to discuss the situation. Funny how $500 million can change someone's perspective. The morning unfolded like a perfectly choreographed symphony of validation. Every major news outlet picked up the story. Tech blogs went crazy analyzing Neuratech's potential impact on Amazon's operations. Supply chain industry publications scrambled to explain how they had missed this revolutionary technology. At 9:30 a.m., the stock market opened. Amazon's stock jumped 3% on the news. Traditional supply chain software companies saw their shares plummet. Global Logistics Solutions, my former employer, dropped 28% in the first hour of trading. By 10 a.m., my lawyer had counted 17 interview requests from major media outlets. The Wall Street Journal wanted to do a profile. Forbes was asking about their 30 under 40 list. TechCrunch had already published 3 different analyses of the acquisition. But the real drama was happening in the venture capital world. Sofia kept me updated through a steady stream of texts. 2 partners at Summit just called me in tears. 3 other VC firms that rejected us are facing angry calls from their investors. Someone just leaked that Google was preparing a $600 million counteroffer. They were too late. At 11 a.m., I finally took a call from James Wilson at Amazon. Olivia, he said, sounding excited but not surprised. The response is even bigger than we expected. Our technical team is already calling this the most important acquisition since Kiva Systems. I leaned back in my chair, watching CNBC replay clips of their interview with an AI expert explaining why Neuratech's technology was game-changing. How's the market taking it? I asked, though I already knew. We're up almost 4% now. But the real story is what's happening to our competitors. They're all scrambling to explain why they don't have anything like Neuratech. Because they had all dismissed it, just like Summit Ventures had. Just like GLS had when they fired me. At noon, I received an unexpected email from Dave Miller, my former supervisor at GLS. Olivia, I owe you an apology. When we let you go, we made a terrible mistake. I see that now. The board is asking questions about how we could have missed this opportunity. I'm not sure I'll survive the fallout. Congratulations on your success. Dave. I didn't respond. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. The afternoon brought more validation. Technical blogs started dissecting Neurotech's patents, marveling at the sophistication of the Nexus protocol. Supply chain experts published analyses showing how the technology could have prevented major disruptions over the past year. But the most satisfying moment came at 2:47 p.m. when my assistant forwarded me an internal memo that had leaked from Summit Ventures. All partners, in light of recent events concerning Neurotech's acquisition by Amazon, we need to immediately review our due diligence procedures. The failure to recognize this opportunity represents a significant lapse in judgment that has already drawn criticism from several major LPs. Michael Forbes' position as managing partner will be discussed at Thursday's emergency board meeting. Regards, Board of Directors. I forwarded it to Sophia with a single word: karma. Her response came immediately: he's finished. 2 other partners just called me asking if you consider letting them invest in your next venture. Apparently, being the person who called a $500 million company worthless isn't great for your career. By end of day, the story had evolved from a simple acquisition announcement into something bigger. A case study in how the traditional venture capital world often misses revolutionary technology because of bias and arrogance. CNBC ran a special segment titled "The Billion-Dollar Blind Spot: How VCs Miss Tech Breakthroughs." They interviewed experts about why established firms often fail to recognize transformative technology. Summit Ventures was mentioned repeatedly, not in a good way. As the sun set, I finally allowed myself to really feel it. The validation, the vindication, the pure, undiluted satisfaction of being proved right in the most public, most undeniable way possible. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from James Wilson. Board wants to fast-track the integration. Can you come to Seattle next week? We're thinking bigger than just supply chain now. This could transform everything. I texted back my agreement, then walked to my window, watching the city lights come alive as darkness fell. 3 years ago, I had stood at a different window, having just been fired, wondering if I was crazy to believe in my idea. Now that idea was worth $500 million, and the people who had laughed were scrambling to explain their short-sightedness. The next morning, I had one important meeting, a breakfast with Sophia to discuss the future. She was waiting at our usual cafe, grinning like a cat that caught a particularly fat canary. So, she said as I sat down, I counted at least 30 VC firms that are now claiming they almost invested in Neurotech. Funny how everyone sees the vision after the fact. I smiled, stirring my coffee. Any word from Summit? Total meltdown. 3 major investors have pulled out. Thorne is being pushed out. Apparently, letting the biggest tech acquisition of the year slip through your fingers because of arrogance isn't great for business. We spent the next hour planning next steps. Amazon wanted to scale Neurotech globally, but they also saw applications beyond supply chain. The underlying technology, the ability to see patterns in complex systems, could revolutionize everything from financial markets to climate science.